Good evening, and welcome to Skep Talk, the monthly speaker series hosted by the Bay Area Skeptics. Before tonight's presentation, a few words about Bay Area Skeptics. As North America's oldest skeptical organization, we are dedicated to promoting critical thinking, logic, and rational thought. In the 1970s and 80s, scientists such as Carl Sagan and magicians such as James Randi established the scientific skepticism movement out of concern about the popular fondness for pseudoscience and the lack of public science literacy. Scientific skepticism embraces evidence-based civil discourse on health, education, consumer protection, and especially the investigation of extraordinary claims. Using the scientific method, we hope to promote skeptical inquiry to reduce irrational thinking in society. This talk is supported by Bay Area Skeptics members such as you. Please visit us at baskeptics.org or join us on Facebook, Twitter, and Meetup. Consider supporting us through convenient monthly donations via Patreon. Patrons receive premiums such as discounts and free t-shirts for our annual Skeptical Conference. But more importantly, members help us make the world just a little more reasonable and rational. And now, tonight's speaker.
Good evening, reasonable people, and welcome to this Bay Area Skeptics monthly Skep Talk. My name is Jay Diamond, and I'll be your host for this evening. Yesterday was Darwin Day, and I can't think of a more fascinating way to bring Darwin's work to life than talking about what we can learn from our projections of that work into the future. Our Skep Talk this evening is titled, Can Star Trek Teach Us About Evolution? A look at how Darwin's work reverberates from the past through the present into the future. We're celebrating a day late because that's how the future works. Our speaker this evening is Dr. Mohamed Noor, professor of biology focusing on genetics and evolution at Duke University. He's also executive vice provost of that institution. Dr. Noor is author of Live Long and Evolve, What Star Trek Can Teach Us About Evolution, Genetics, and Life on Other Worlds. He regularly gives talks using science fiction to teach scientific principles and has served as a scientific consultant on Star Trek Discovery, and I learned this evening also on the new season of Strange New Worlds. So I'm sure we're going to get a lot of really great spoilers tonight. Welcome, Dr. Noor.
Thank you so much, Jared. Very generous introduction. Thank you for having me. Thank you also to Jeannie Scott and everybody else who helped make this come together. It is an honor and a pleasure to speak to the Bay Area Skeptics and also everybody else who's there in the live chat. Thank you all. I'm just going to go ahead and dive in if that's okay.
Let me just ask you, did you do anything fun for Darwin Day yesterday?
Oh, I just worked. I went to dinner with a friend. I mean, it was fine. Okay. It's been, as many of you guys know, it's been a challenging time for academia the last couple of weeks. So there's been a lot of work to do, but we celebrate as we can.
We do. Just before we start, I just want to mention that viewers tonight are going to see something that viewers after tonight will not see, and that is some live video from Star Trek. And we are omitting that after tonight's talk for copyright reasons. So if you see odd cuts on this after the initial viewing, you know what that's all about. So that's all I wanted to say. Dr. Noor, take it away.
Thank you very much. Again, thank you all for having me here. And thank you for being here. So the talk I'm going to give you is a talk that I've given at various science fiction conventions and other sorts of venues for several years now. And let me give you a little bit of history how this came about. By the way, I have to tease you in the sense of for the introduction. You just read the top part of the title. Can Star Trek teach us about evolution? The answer is also in the title, which is yup. So I've been interested in educating people about evolution for a long time. And as many of you know, and I'll come back to this a little bit later on, evolution is considered a somewhat controversial topic among some quarters here in the United States, especially, and also in other parts of the world, particular other parts. I was interested in finding a way to engage people in evolution. And what's interesting is that my colleague, as a professor who has the office right next to mine, said, well, why don't you just write a book just teaching evolution and just talking about it? Of course, A, there are 100 of those already out there, but B, I wanted to find a different approach into it. So let's talk for a second. How and why do people learn about biology? And I'm talking about after grade school. Obviously, in grade school, you're kind of stuck, or maybe if you're in college, you have to take a biology prereq for something. But often after you finish high school, or if you've gone to college after that, maybe you follow things on TV, maybe you watch some nice PBS specials, maybe you watch Animal Planet. If you're really engaged, maybe what you do is you actually pick up one of these books. So these are books from about 7 or 8 years ago. Who We Are and How We Got Here by David Reich. Excellent book, by the way. And also Carl Zimmer, also excellent book. She Has Her Mother's Laugh. So I normally, if I'm giving this talk live, I actually ask everybody in the audience, raise your hand if you've read one of these two books, because these were New York Times bestsellers. And usually maybe like 1, 2 hands go up, even in a fairly packed room. People haven't usually done it. In contrast, when I say, how many of you saw this movie, just as an example, typically over half the room raises their hand. There is a reason they call it pop culture. It's because it is popular. That's where that comes from. So what I've wanted to do, and I should be clear, I'm not the first person to do this by far. Many people have been doing this, and there's actually a growing interest in doing this, throughout a lot of academia. I want to leverage people's interest in something they already love, like say the Avengers or Marvel Cinematic Universe in general, or Star Trek, to get them to learn about evolution. Why? Because it's basically an easier entry point for people who don't see themselves right off the bat as biologists. And if you think about it, science fiction really is at its heart a set of hypotheses around the future or around what you might see in other worlds. I like Star Trek as a good case study because there's a long set of material. There's actually like over 900 episodes of Star Trek. And yes, I have seen them all. Over 900 episodes of Star Trek. There's various movies. There's very little magic, but they try to explain things using science throughout this whole frame. So my goal here is to bring evolutionary concepts and evolutionary thinking to interesting thought questions from science fiction. And the thought questions might be something like, what would life look like on other worlds? If any of you have watched the classic 1960s Star Trek, you may be familiar with this beast. This is called the Horta. Looks a little bit like pizza spilled on a shag carpet. That is not what we particularly expect life on another world to look like. But instead, you might see something that looks a little bit more like this. So something that's microscopic, kind of gel-like, that's maybe unicellular. By the way, that is just a picture of hair gel, but it gives you an idea of what something might look like, for example, on Europa or on Enceladus or one of these moons of Jupiter or Saturn, things like that, places where we might expect to see life. Now, this is not usually what we see depicted in science fiction. I see somebody write in the chat, by the way, no kill eye about the Horta. Good knowledge. This is not usually what we see in science fiction. What we see typically are these large mammalian bipeds, and they're typically humanoid. So in the top row you see here, we see a Vulcan, we see an Andorian with the blue one with the antennae, we see the Tellarites, they're kind of pig-faced people, but they basically look like people. They look like modified people. That's probably kind of unlikely, but let's set that aside. But what's interesting is in all sci-fi, we always see this familiar background too. So this is the lower picture is from the most recent Star Trek movie to come to theaters, Star Trek Beyond. And if you look at the back, it looks strangely like California. There's trees and bushes and grass and things like that. Question. And interestingly, in sci-fi, it actually goes beyond X series. There are all these other aliens that can produce living hybrids with humans. So Spock being one of the most famous examples. He's a Vulcan human hybrid, but there's several others that are depicted. And I counted when I was writing my book, I counted over 15 of these alien species that can reproduce with us. This feels exceedingly unlikely, exceedingly so. So let's come back to the first question. And this is the way I like to introduce evolutionary thinking. Could we see life as we know it elsewhere, and how? Right? This is going to be the overarching question for this whole talk. The most logical answer to how is that maybe this life we're seeing in some other place is not fully independent of life on Earth. Then somehow it's actually directly related. Related meaning that we share at some point in time a common ancestor. So I'm going to split this talk in half. For the first part of the talk, I'm going to give some basic principles of evolutionary biology. Right? This. I know many of you here probably know a lot of evolutionary biology. That's fine. I mean, we're just going to rehash to make sure everybody's starting on the same page. And then we're going to use those principles to assess the validity of 3 hypotheses that are depicted in the series for why you might see so many humanoid aliens. Now, what's interesting about this is one of those hypotheses actually kind of works. Kind of works. The other 2 absolutely do not work. Now, what's important about this is that we're doing this in the context of this fictional example of, humanoid aliens. However, the kind of thinking, the kind of analysis we're going to do would be similar to what was applied if any life in outer space that we encountered might look like life on Earth. If something, for example, looked like a bacterium that we found on Enceladus or on Titan or something like that. Okay? We ready to dive in? Let's do it. So I'm going to start with a little bit of history. This is using real history, but also depicted in Star Trek. We know that all life on Earth had a single origin, right? That everything on Earth is actually related. And this was actually depicted in Star Trek in the series The Next Generation. This is the 80s to 90s Star Trek. It was around 3.8 billion years ago. So those who are familiar with the series, tons of evidence for this. And the outcome of the single origin of life is an incredible diversity of life that we see today. And this is obviously just a very small fraction of the diversity of life we see today. And it's, of course, overrepresenting vertebrates and things like that. Now, how did this come about? How did we get this incredible diversity of life from that single origin, from that single original thing? You're probably thinking to yourself, the answer is obvious. The answer is evolution. That's how the life we know came about. Now, evolution has 2 fundamental processes. One of them is basically the formation of new lineages from a single lineage. So if you go back, and if you look at the left side of the bottom there, if you go back in time, horses, zebras, and donkeys shared a common ancestor and were one species, but they have diversified, where one lineage led to the modern horse, another lineage led to the modern zebra, and a third led to the modern donkey. Within each of these lineages, we also had change over time. So if you were to go back like 60 million years ago, and you see this at the bottom of the right figure, 60 million years ago, horses were actually just the size of dogs. They were very, very little. They had toes. They didn't have the hooves you see. But we see in the fossil record this very clear transition from that small form to the modern horse, which stands much taller, different overall shape, having a hoof, things like that. So that is change within lineage. Now, I want to stay on the left side first in the context of this different lineages over time. Now, if we can look at this in the context of various horse forms, but this also works for any sort of bit of life. And we call these, by the way, phylogenetic trees. These are the trees of relatedness. So on the right here, we see various primates. So if you look at there, at the very bottom right, we see human. Human and gorilla shared a common ancestor about 7 million years ago. Human and orangutan, 14 million years ago. We emerged a tree of all life. It's going to be very crowded. A tree of all life out there. This is a nice figure I found of that. What I did, because the lettering is really small, I just highlighted a couple of groups there. You see all the mammals on the far right, amphibians, fish, insects, fungi, plants, etc. All going back to, like I said, that 3.8 billion years ago. It's a long time back. Now, what's interesting about this is we're actually related to things like grass. So as you go outside and you step on the lawn, you're stepping on, cousin Harry. That feels uncomfortable. And the reason it feels uncomfortable is I think this is often avoided in schools in the United States. At least it was where I grew up. I mean, it probably depends on which school you went to. And this has been documented several times. There was a survey published about 14 years ago in 2011 in Science magazine. And in that survey, 28%, so barely over a quarter, of high school teachers said that they described the evidence for evolution in a straightforward manner. 13%, so about half that number, actually spent an hour and a half or longer explicitly advocating alternatives, saying, oh, that's just one theory. Let me show you some other theories. And the majority, 60%, just avoided controversy. When I went to high school, I took an AP biology. And in AP biology, I remember my teacher getting up there and saying, well, some people think that it's evolution. Some people have other ideas. I don't want to go into that. And he just left it alone. That didn't work well for people for AP exams, by the way. So how are people supposed to get comfortable with this idea of common ancestry if teachers are avoiding it. Now, let me stress, I love teachers. I am not blaming them. I understand that their jobs are on the line, and it's often politicized, and they may actually get fired if they follow what they're supposed to do. So I'm not blaming them at all. Interestingly, if you watch Star Trek Deep Space Nine, which is supposed to be set in 2370, it appears similar things have happened in the future. Anybody who watches this show knows that Kai Wynn, that person who's speaking last, is most definitely not reasonable. But it's interesting that they actually have this teacher, Keiko O'Brien, saying that, what do we do when we talk about evolution or creation of the universe? And there's this controversy that's still supposedly existing in 2370. I hope that's not the case, and you skeptics will help us make that not be the case. But let's talk for just a minute about what is the evidence for common ancestry on Earth, common ancestry of all life on Earth. Okay. Now, obviously, I could spend, an entire, day giving evidence for this, but I'm just going to highlight a couple of things. First of all life as we know it on Earth is water-based. It uses water as a solvent. It's carbon-based. So things like amino acids, DNA, fats, carbohydrates, those all have a carbon backbone. The reason I have the horde on the side with the line through is that's nominally a silicon-based life form. That's hypothetical. But all life that we know is carbon-based. And it all has inheritance by nucleic acids, meaning DNA and RNA. So that's a lot of sharing. Interestingly, we have basically the same DNA code for amino acids across all life. What that means is, you may be familiar, there's a 3-letter code of DNA for every amino acid that's formed. So for example, if you have the 3-letter DNA code ATG, that is associated with the amino acid methionine. There's no fundamental reason why that has to be true in every species, but that is true in every species on Earth. That's true in humans and mosquitoes and sunflowers and yeast and E. coli. It's basically the same DNA code across all life. And there's no inherent reason why that has to be the case if you didn't have this sort of common ancestry. I like that one because I'm a geneticist, so that one appeals to me. But let me give you one that's maybe even more intuitive, maybe that you can just look at and be like, oh, okay, that makes sense. Let's talk about the classification of species. Many of you are probably familiar with the classification of species. This dates back to Linnaeus from 1735. So if you look at a dog is an animal. It's not a plant. It's not a fungus, not a bacteria, things like that. It's a vertebrate, meaning it has a backbone. It's mammal, meaning it's hairy and it gives milk to its young. It's a canine, as you see by aspects of its appearance. If we look at a fox, it shares all those same attributes. It's very similar to a dog in every one of the attributes we have, and it's classified very similarly. If we look at a cat, it's an animal, still, not a plant, not anything else. It's a vertebrate, still has a backbone. It's still a mammal, it's hairy, gives milk to its young, but it's not canine. It's a distinctly different appearance. If you look at a seagull, it's an animal, still a vertebrate, still has a backbone, but it is no longer hairy, does not give milk to its young. And if we look at a fly, it's just an animal. It has none of those other traits. So when you look at this, dog and fox share a lot of attributes. Dog and cat share less. Dog and seagull share less. And dog and fly share less still. And the classification that we use, interestingly, is supposed to reflect shared ancestry. That was actually not the way it was originally designed, but it does reflect shared ancestry. You basically share more traits on average if you have a more recent in time shared ancestor. So dog and fox have an ancestor not very far back. Dog and cat a little bit further back, dog and seagull further back, and dog and fly very far back. Now, this makes sense, and you're probably already aware of much shorter time. My computer has frozen. One moment, please. There it goes. If you look at a much shorter time scale within families. So generally speaking, siblings share many, many traits. You and your first cousin probably share fewer, and you and your second cousin probably share fewer on average, right? And this is because of the same reason, right? That if you were to look at this, individuals with the most recent shared ancestors share the most traits, both when you're looking at an evolutionary timescale, but also even when you're looking at a family tree. And this is actually true for the same reason. You basically share more DNA the more recent your shared ancestor is. And for this reason, the classification that was introduced by Linnaeus mostly still, right? And this was introduced in 1735. That was a long time before anybody was sequencing DNA. right? But using a whole bunch of traits, they created this overall set of relationships. And now, as we actually add DNA sequences, we are recapitulating the same relationships that Linnaeus talked about. So these are actual DNA sequences from cytochrome C oxidase subunit 1. And if you look at it, dog and fox are identical. Dog and cat only differ for the last. So it's fascinating. This makes sense. I mean, please tell me why it's wrong. That is not the classical evidence for evolution. What people often go back to, but I think is also very useful, is the fossil record, right? And what's great about the fossil record is there's tons of transitional form. You've probably heard people make an allegation out there that, oh, there's all sorts of holes in the fossil record, all sorts of gaps in the fossil record. That was kind of true like 70 years ago. It's so much less true now. So what we have here on the left side, we have the fossil record showing the origin of birds from dinosaurs. And on the right side of the figure, we show the origin of cetaceans. These are the things like whales and dolphins, things like that, from hoofed land mammals. And we have very clear transitional records for it. This is fascinating because it's not like these transitional fossils just jump up out of the ground to us. These have to be found just almost by chance. So that's really fascinating that we can actually fill in these gaps so beautifully to show this change over time, which is, again, also reflecting common ancestry. So I don't want to belabor the evidence for evolution, but what I do want to do before we move on is I wanted to hit on two common misconceptions that come up about evolution. One of them is often associated with figures like this. You've probably seen a figure like this. Often there's another graph after the person kind of hunched over a computer showing the modern human. That's me right now. But what this looks like is it looks like we have ancestors that are chimpanzees, like chimpanzees evolved into humans. That is not correct. We do not have ancestors that are chimpanzees, but instead we share ancestors with chimpanzees. Chimpanzees existed. You did not descend from your sibling or from your first cousin, but you shared you shared an ancestor with your sibling and your first cousin. Okay. So let me hit one more misconception. And this one's one that was actually depicted in a Star Trek episode. I'm going to play a very short clip. This is from the original series of Star Trek. So it's a fascinating verbiage that they use there. So they are as far above us on the evolutionary timescale as we are above the amoeba. It's an interesting verbiage. And I like this less evolved, more evolved, above, below sort of verbiage. That is very inaccurate. Every life form out there has been evolving for the same amount of time. Amoeba have been evolving since 3.8 billion years ago, as have we, as have chimpanzees. Everything's been evolving for that same length of time. We are not above them. It's interesting when people say that, like, what do you mean by above? I mean, are we judging species by their ability to like build guns? I mean, it's unclear. I mean, shapeshifters, right? I'm not a shapeshifter. Amoeba can build can develop a hardened cyst and survive in the cold. More evolved, there's no processes of evolution. And then from there, I'm going to walk into more of the hypotheses that are laid out in Star Trek. So again, to this question, why might extraterrestrial life look similar to life on Earth? One possible explanation is natural selection. Now, many of you probably heard this idea of natural selection, but let me explain what natural selection is using an example that you also may have heard of. So natural selection has a couple of steps, right? First, you have the introduction of a random mutation. That random mutation has an advantage and it's inherited. And as it's inherited, it's allowing the individuals who bear it to get more food or have more kids or survive better, reproduce better, and it just spreads over time. So a classic example of this is Biston betularia, the peppered moth. Many of you have probably heard of this particular example. It's actually been sometimes maligned unfairly. It's actually an amazing example. If you were to go back to, say, like 1820, every peppered moth looks like the lower left one in this picture. They were just kind of peppered looking. As you had the Industrial Revolution in the 1850s, you started killing off the lichens on the trees, and you had a blackening of the trees. Fascinatingly, between 1850 and 1900, we had this complete transition in peppered moth where you went from all of them looking peppered to all of them looking black, like the one on the top right there. So by 1900, all you found were the black ones. The reason is obvious. Those that were black were more cryptic. They could hide on those trees that were blackened and didn't have lichen. They weren't getting picked off by blue jays or whatever birds were after them. Fascinatingly, that's one that actually worked the other direction too. In the 1950s, a series of Clean Air Acts were passed, both in the UK as well as in the United States. The trees cleaned up, lichens grew back, and now you can hardly ever find those black ones. Almost all of them are peppered again. So what's interesting about this is that natural selection is actually mathematically inevitable if you have three conditions met. If you have variation, if it's heritable, and if it affects survival or reproduction. This is true if you work with peppered moss. I'm going to use a different hypothetical example. This is purely hypothetical. Let's just pretend we have two variants. We're going to call one of them Omicron BA5, hypothetically. We'll call another one Omicron XBB 1.5, hypothetically. Let's say we're starting a population that is primarily Omicron BA5 and has just a little bit of XBB 1.5. For whatever reason, XBB 1.5 spreads a little bit better. Maybe it's a virus. Maybe it infects people and spreads a little bit faster, such that the first one can double every generation, but the second one can actually triple every generation. And what happens is as you iterate over time, you started at 9% XBB 1.5. Now, after one generation, it's 13%. After a couple more, it's 24%. By the time you go just 10 generations in, you're at 79%. This is just math. That's all it is. It's just math. And if you have variation, if it's heritable, and if it affects survival reproduction, you will always get natural selection. So some people like to say that natural selection is just a theory. Like it's not, I mean, a theory in this sense is just it's not the kind of like, I have a theory that my mom is home right now. A theory is something where all evidence shows that this is correct. And this is, in this case, it's just math. That's all it is. Now, what natural selection can sometimes do, this gets to the alien piece, is that natural selection can sometimes cause convergence. What we mean by convergence is that distantly related species can evolve to look similar to each other. So I'm using here as an example a shark and a dolphin. Sharks and dolphins are radically different from each other, but from a first glance at them, if you look at the bottom picture, they look kind of similar to each other, right? And it's because they're living in the same environment, so they're experiencing similar selection pressures, right? They're trying to avoid predators. They're living in the same environment over time. But if you were to slice into them, I don't advise this, but if you were to slice into them, inside they look radically different, right? Sharks have bones made of cartilage. Dolphins have bones made of bones made of bone. Sharks are fish, so they just have gills. They don't have lungs. Dolphins have lungs. Dolphins nurse their young. Sharks obviously don't do that. So there's a trillion differences between these two things. However, because of the environment in which they live, they have come to look similar. Now, could that be true for these aliens in Star Trek? So these are a Romulan, a Bajoran, a human, Andorian, Ocampan, and Betazoid. If you look especially at the two on the right, they look very, very, very human. And even the most different doesn't look all that different. Could that be a result of convergent evolution? I would guess, even though we're not slicing into them, and I don't advise slicing into aliens if we find them, I would argue they're probably a little bit too similar to be a result of convergence if they were truly independent. Now, the Star Trek writers identified this. And again, there are three hypotheses presented throughout the various Star Trek series, at least, to try to explain why there's so many humanoid aliens and why they look so much like us. Many of you are probably familiar with the first one I'm going to show. The first one I'm going to show is from Star Trek The Next Generation. It's an episode called The Chase. In that episode, they were basically chasing, as you would say. They were following a set of clues to try to understand why these little DNA segments were very similar across different species. They put them all together and a video started. I'm going to play a clip of that video now. I love that Klingon's reaction. He was expecting it to be some like recipe for a big weapon or something like that. That was a great response. So let me recap a couple of things that were said in here. And there's a couple of quotes from what you just saw. Life evolved on my planet for all others in this part of the galaxy. We left our world, explored the stars, and found none like ourselves. And somehow they seeded these primordial oceans where it says the seed codes directed your evolution toward the physical form resembling ours. So I'm going to break down for each of the hypotheses we watch. I'm going to break it down to 3 elements. And for each of those elements, I want to assess and see, like, do they work? So for this particular one, it starts with the idea that maybe the raw materials for life came from outer space, or possibly even a full organism. So either some DNA or amino acids came from outer space, or maybe even like a bacterium, something like that. We don't know exactly what was seeded. The second is this idea that there was convergence. Remember, we talked about convergent evolution a minute ago. There was convergence with life seeded elsewhere at the same time. So, Romulus, Cardassia Prime, etc. And the last part is this persistence of the seed codes over time. Okay. So this will be interesting to look at. Let's start with the first one. Could the raw materials for life have come from outer space? And the answer to that is yes. It is quite possible raw materials for life came from outer space. Again, the first life was estimated close to 4 billion years ago. We do see evidence for extraterrestrially formed amino acids. I actually saw another study of this just very recently showing that this is quite possible. That if something was missing here on Earth, maybe it landed in a meteorite, maybe some components of DNA or RNA came in via meteorites. Quite possible. Indeed, it's even possible like the first life form even came by a meteorite. We have no evidence against it. So in principle, there's no reason the first life on Earth may not have been seeded from space. And this is an idea that's called panspermia, right? That life was seeded here on Earth and maybe seeded in other places, at different times. Now, the second prediction here gets a little bit more problematic. This is the idea that we had convergence with life seeded elsewhere at the same time. Now, I mention this to people, they often point out this first problem, that if we assume natural selection, the conditions had to be very similar, that, Earth had to be very similar to Cardassia Prime, had to be very similar to, very eloquently by Stephen Jay Gould, the famous paleontologist. He's also the only paleontologist that I know who played himself in The Simpsons. But he has an interesting thought experiment of if you were to take the tape of life and play it out and then rewind and play it again, would you get the same outcome? So the underpinning of this question is, what is the role of random chance events in evolution? If random chance events have very little role, if you replay the tape of life in multiple places or multiple times, you get the same outcome. If random chance events are very important, then you would not get the same outcome. And I would argue that random chance events are extraordinarily important. I'm going to give you just 2 examples. Here's the first one. This is the mitochondria. You're probably thinking to yourself, this is one of the great successes of high school biology. The mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. Well, where it came from is interesting. About 2 billion years ago, or maybe just under, there was a single-celled organism that swallowed a bacterium, and that bacterium survived inside that larger single-celled organism, and it had the machinery to provide energy to it. This energy helped it reproduce, and the bacteria also reproduced inside it and was then inherited into its offspring. Over time, that smaller bacterium that was the mitochondria that we see actually has its own. This is a really, really, really big event, and having the origin of the mitochondria probably helped with the origin of multicellularity. So everything that is associated with plants, animals, fungi today is probably directly associated with that random chance event that happened way far back. I'll give you another one, and this other one you may be already familiar with. If you go back about 65 million years ago, there was an asteroid impact onto Earth back in Mexico. There's a lot of volcanic activity. And as a result of that, what happened is the planet, which at the time had been dominated by dinosaurs, the dinosaurs were largely pushed out and had gone extinct, with the exception of those ones that today we call birds. And we had an incredible diversification of mammals. Mammals were around before that, but once you got rid of those giant dinosaurs, the mammals were allowed to diversify and occupy a whole bunch more niches. So let's look at this in the context of the tree of life on Earth. So let's zoom in on a couple of points here. Let's do the second one first. So here you see that mass extinction at 65 million years ago. And look at how many of those mammalian lines start, if you follow that arc going back, how many of those mammalian lines start right then? That played a huge role in basically the Earth we see today, and likely in humans in particular. If you go further back, if you go back to like about 2 billion years ago, there's the mitochondria, and pretty much all the organisms you usually think of, the non-microbial ones, are attributable to that mitochondrial event. So this is a really, 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 really important part of evolution. And these were random chance events. There's no way you could say that these are things that would necessarily have happened on other worlds. So when you look at this, how can we rule out this role of random chance evolution? And fascinatingly, what's interesting about this also is this particular hypothesis assumes that, truthfully, we would be more closely related to grass than we are to Klingons or Cardassians or Vulcans. Yet we don't produce hybrids, like I said, with grass, but we can supposedly with Klingons or Cardassians or Vulcans. So this doesn't really work. So let's go back to what may have happened. Here we have the dough-faced lady, and there's ancient Earth. Ancient Earth is, of course, now before it was green, there wouldn't have been grass yet. They're seeding life on all these different planets. Maybe they're aiming asteroids at all of them. I'm not quite sure. And somehow we get this incredible similarity at the end, this incredible level of convergence. That seems astronomically unlikely. I will say that one person, actually, when I've given this talk before, every now and then I have one person in particular, but there are multiple other people who have said it too. But maybe life itself is astronomically unlikely, and they seeded like 1 trillion worlds, and it only worked on 6. Okay, I can't rule that out, but it still seems very, very unlikely. The other piece to all this is this comes back to this last hypothesis about the persistence of code. So that video that you saw with the dough-faced lady was supposedly embedded in our DNA. So I'm going to make some very unfair assumptions here. And I apologize for the unfair assumptions here, but let's just see, could this code have persisted over the 4 billion years of life? So if this code persisted, we have to think that random mutations would disrupt the code. And I'm assuming it persisted in the context of those letters, A, C, G, and T. So I'm just going to do a little bit of math. Let's just look at the first 1.5 billion years of life as microbes. Mutation rate, really low mutation rate, 1 in 10 times 10 to the minus 10, 1 times 10 to the minus 10. If we're to do the calculations for that, the probability that any one of those DNA elements would not have changed is about 1 in 3 million. Now, the probability that enough of them would be there to get a video, no. So overall, for hypothesis 1, is it possible raw materials for life came from outer space? Yes. Could we see convergence with life seeded elsewhere at the same time, going back 4 billion years ago? No, because that really does assume that a negligible role of random chance events. And could we see persistence of the seed codes over time? I use some unfair assumptions, but I would argue no on that one as well. Okay. So let's move on to hypothesis number 2. For hypothesis number 2, we're going to jump back in time to the original series of Star Trek from the 1960s. So this particular episode is from an episode called Return to Tomorrow. Kirk, Spock, and some others come to this planet. They're summoned down by somebody named Sargon, but they do not know what Sargon looks like or who he is. So I'm going to play the little clip now. I love that freeze frame right there. It's like you're getting kissed from Kirk. So let's recap this one. And by the way, some of you who are hardcore Star Trek fans may recognize the person playing Dr. Ann Mulhall as the same actress who plays in The Next Generation, Dr. Catherine Pulaski. So what we heard in this episode was it's possible you are a descendants, Captain Kirk. 6,000 centuries ago, we're going to focus on that length of time, 6,000 centuries ago, our vessels were colonizing the galaxy, perhaps our own legend. Okay, so let's break this down into 3 predictions. And let me clarify, for these predictions here, I'm not necessarily saying that they're right. I'm just saying whether we can disprove them. So for the first one is that Earth was visited by alien forms. I'm just going to put a check by that, not because I think it happened, but just because I can't disprove it, especially something that happened that long ago, maybe. So let's focus on the second and the third ones. The second one is that 600,000 years ago, there were some humanoids on Earth that then changed to look like modern day humans, but maybe on other places changed to look like those other aliens that we've seen. And the last one is that modern humans descend from these spacefarers. And that's an important, I'm distinguishing those two for a reason that you'll see in a moment. So what was happening on Earth sides with, but not identical to what you would see a human today? There's an artist's conception of it in the lower right, but you see a fossil kind of in the middle. It is possible. Well, we know on Earth that probably Homo erectus-like forms evolved to what we see as human life here. It is possible that then on these other planets, something that's like Homo erectus would evolve to look like a Vulcan and have maybe pointed ears. I'm skipping the whole copper-based blood, by the way. Anybody who's a start to these other humanoid forms, yeah, because that's 6 on Earth. However, this does have a very problematic assumption because this assumes that we are not related to chimps, gorillas, or other extant life forms. This assumes that we have an ancestor that is an alien and that everything else here is not descended from that. But as I said, and you saw in the beginning, there's a ton of DNA evidence and all sorts of other evidence that we are related to all the life here on Earth. And importantly, the fossil record of all the transitions happened here on Earth. We see the fossils here in the ground on Earth. So unfortunately, while the first and second predictions kind of work, that maybe Earth was visited by alien life forms, maybe. Could you have this change over 600,000 years ago to get different kinds of humanoids in different worlds? Maybe. But modern humans descending from these spacefarers, no. I think we have to say no to that because, again, it assumes that we're not related to everything else here on Earth. That's important thinking. Now, again, I will say it's possible that all Earth life came from a microbe 4 billion years ago, but that's saying that still that all life is related. So it still doesn't work with what was shown here. So last but not least, this is a very short clip, by the way. There's a hypothesis that's kind of similar to the previous one. This is also from the original series. Instead, it suggests that Earth organisms went to outer space. I'm going to give you a little bit of context on this, why I have the word context written there. This is the case where the Enterprise showed up at a planet. They went down and they found these people who look like Native Americans. The plant life looked like Earth's, and they also found a large obelisk there. So I'm going to play a little clip in terms of their studies of this obelisk. Let's break this down a little bit. What they said is the preservers passed through the galaxy, rescuing primitive cultures in danger of extinction and seeding them where they could live. So this is the opposite of the previous one. The previous one is that basically humans came from outer space. In this case, we're saying that humans from Earth or human-like forms from Earth went to outer space. So let's break this down into three things. The first part is that some life on Earth went to outer space. The second is the timing, and I'm going to play with the timing. We're not going to use the timing it has here. I'm going to play with the timing. And the third part is that modern aliens descend from ancient Earth hominids. This is the opposite of the previous one. Okay. So on the first one, could some life on Earth have gone into outer space? The answer to that is probably yes. It probably has, in fact, happened. Not in the context of humanoids, but in the context of space probes that we send out into space. We send space probes pretty regularly out there. What we cannot do is we cannot completely kill off every spore that happens to be on these probes, because it would be enormous. Mars Curiosity rover, just as an example, probably 278,000 spores on the flight system force sent up, and 56,000 have been protected on hardware surfaces. This is actually a big danger. We're very concerned about forward contamination. By forward contamination, imagine, for example, a probe goes to Enceladus and it lands there, and there's some E. coli or some fungus or something like that on it, and it introduces to Enceladus. And then later we go back and we find E. coli on Enceladus. This is a big concern. In fact, there's a committee called the Committee on Space Research Panel on Planetary Protection that has guidelines for the sterilization needed for spacecraft. And again, we can't go to 100%, but we try to get rid of as much as possible. Still, it's quite likely we have introduced some life to Mars already. It also may have happened accidentally. So remember, I mentioned that 65 million years ago impact into Mexico or the Gulf of Mexico. It's quite possible that some rocks from Earth got thrown up into space and may have landed on Mars or in some of the outer planets. So yeah, it's quite possible some life on Earth has gone to other worlds. Now, for the second one, I'm going to drop the whole Native American thing. That was just kind of weird. But let's make it a little bit more similar to the other one. Let's say that Earth humanoids from put onto these other worlds. Then, okay, that makes things work a little bit better, that maybe they changed over time. Of course, you can't just drop somebody down on Neptune or Uranus or things like that. But if you put the sustaining life forms, maybe, and this gets into the third part, could modern aliens have descended from these ancient Earth hominids? Right? We would expect some evolution over 600,000 years. There'd be some genetic change. There'd be some physical features. This is a testable prediction. If we were able to find an Andorian or a Cardassian, as in this picture, we could actually test it. What we would predict is that humanoids, all the different humanoids, irrespective of where they're from, should be more similar genetically to each other than any of them, including the humans on Earth, are to chimpanzees. So I have here on the bottom right are actual sequences from aliens. No, I'm just kidding. Just kidding. These are fictional sequences. There's a human at the top, Cardassian, Andorian, and chimp. And if you look at this, this would fit the prediction. You see in these fake DNA sequences, human, Cardassian, and Andorian are all very similar to each other. And all of them are more similar to each other than any of them are to chimp. Okay. Now this, let me give you a fictional example. Imagine you have two people, John and Barb. Both of them are HIV positive. Each one is pointing their fingers at the other one. What you do is you get a whole bunch of HIV isolates from John and from Barb, and then you would make a DNA sequence, and then you develop. If this is the tree you got, you see all of Barb's sequences are very similar to each other, and they're nested within John's sequences. So John has some sequences that are more similar to Barb's than they are to others of John's. What this proves is it proves that John necessarily infected Barb and not the other way around. Now, what I was just showing you a second ago is the same kind of test. I'm using exactly the same tree here to infer whether something went from Earth to other worlds or from other worlds to Earth. So if you were to develop this sort of phylogenetic tree of using similarity, humans, Vulcans, Klingons, and Cardassians, all of them will be more similar to each other than any of them are to chimpanzee or gorilla. So this is an approach that's already used here on Earth all the time. We could use it for these aliens to figure it out. And if we go, now we're going to go a little deeper into the Star Trek world. If you watch Star Trek Voyager, this is consistent with what was shown in Voyager's episode Distant Origin about the aliens called Voth. These are these reptilians. They're supposedly descendants of Earth hadrosaurs that escaped the mass extinction. And in that episode, they did what I just said. They used genetic data to infer that these Voth necessarily came from Earth. They found similarity in these genetic markers to lots of Earth species. So this is exactly something that's been shown already in Star Trek as well. So this particular one, could some life on Earth have gone to space? Yes. Timing, I played with the timing, but that's okay. Yes. And modern aliens, could they descend from ancient Earthlings? I mean, again, I have no evidence to show it's not true, and it is a testable prediction. The one challenge, though, is that you can't just drop off Earth people again on Neptune or Uranus, as I said. You have to find a hospitable environment, and you have to move enough other life, like plants and microbes, to keep them all alive. So coming back to the big question, could we see life as we know it elsewhere, something that looks very similar to life on Earth, and how? The answer is yes, if it came from Earth. It's not the most satisfying answer, and if any of you read the Martian Chronicles, this kind of connects with that as well. But this is the most likely answer if we saw something that looked a lot like life on Earth, of why we would have seen it, that it actually came from Earth. Now, I want to come back to something from earlier. What about all that interbreeding? Remember I mentioned all those hybrids that we see from all these other planets with humans? If humans came from Earth within the past 100,000 years, we know that's possible. And the reason we know it's possible is that we have evidence for hybridization among humanoids on Earth just within the past 100,000 years. So most of us here on this call probably have a little bit of DNA, some genes from ancient Neanderthal. Some of you may also have a little bit of Denisovan, that's another ancient humanoid on here. This happened on Earth within the past 100,000 years. We know there were hybrids formed. So if something went from Earth to another place within the past 100,000 years, we know they probably could still make hybrids too. So it all comes together. Now let's talk about all the different things we've discussed in this talk. This is a Star Trek talk. We're 56 minutes in. We've talked about common ancestry of life and the evidence for it, how it's reflecting classification. We've challenged some misconceptions about evolution. We talked about how natural selection is mathematically inevitable. We've talked about convergent evolution. Life on Earth may have been seeded from outer space. Again, this concept of Star Trek. So let's come back to the big picture. Why do we do this? Why do hypotheses and by their interest area? So what I have here, I have a picture. I'm going to show you a couple of examples from the classroom of cases of this. There's a class I taught with my colleague, Professor Eric Spana, called The Biology Behind Popular Science Fiction, TV, and Movies. The particular picture there was from 2017. One particular day in this class, we went to the Duke Lemur Center and talked about the biogeography of Madagascar and all the lemurs there. So you see that in the left panel there. The next day, we went to go see Kong Skull Island in the theaters, and that's depicted in the right panel. So we challenged the students in the class to describe why you see this diversity of life on Skull Island based on the principles you learned from the Lemur Center in the context of lemurs on Madagascar. And let me tell you, they were really into it. They were really excited to do this. The advantage for me is I want to reach people who may not be ready to just start right off the bat diving to the science. Some people are born naturalists, and that's great. But some people just love watching Kong Skull Island or Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. or whatever Marvel Cinematic Universe show that people are interested in. This is a way of trying to get at them by using something they already like. I'm going to show you actually the final project from somebody from a different class. This is a class I still teach sometimes. It's called Genetics, Evolution, Star Trek. Now, in this, and this uses actually the book that you saw in the very beginning as the textbook for it. What the students are supposed to do is they're supposed to develop a final project by video that actually includes a lot of the concepts from the class. So I'm going to play for you a clip from this particular student. The student who contributed this, his name is Harry Wong. This is not the whole video. He actually gave me like an 8-minute video. I'm going to play you like a 1.5-minute clip and then a 1-minute clip. So let me play the first one. That's a lot of science just in that little clip that you guys saw, right? I was kind of blown away. One of the best things about this is I don't know any of these people in the video. The person who turned this in basically got his whole dorm to act out the different characters. And he was basically just the script writer and the camera person. So it's pretty amazing. I'm going to show you just a tiny clip because I know it's a little glitchy when you're watching these things on Zoom or on YouTube. It's a little glitchy. I'm going to play you just a tiny clip of his the fight scene he had at the end. I don't know if it'll work very well given this context, but we'll try it. Basically, he asked me at the end, if I have 5 minutes of content, can I have a 2-minute fight scene at the end? I was like, yeah, go to town, man. Those sound effects are so dramatic. I don't know if you can actually see like the cracking of his arm as they grabbed it and broke it. It's pretty amazing. Now, one of the things I've also done, and I'm almost done. I know I've gone a little bit over the hour mark, but I'll just say two more quick things. One of the other things I've also done is I've been trying to create a lot of content on YouTube. So I have a YouTube channel called BioTrekkie Explains, where we go over bits of science, usually just a couple of minutes, bits of science from various Star Trek episodes and things like that. Now, one of the things that we did is I had a little IRB study to look at to see how useful it was to have the sci-fi content in there to get people engaged with the science that's in there. And we did a little study, and this is a survey from people who took it. The questions you can see on there is how likely would you have been to watch a science video about prions in this case if it did not relate to Star Trek? And what you see is about half or more, well more than half of the viewers were somewhere between neither likely nor unlikely all the way to extremely unlikely to watch this video. Whereas having this sci-fi content is really what brought them in to watch these particular videos. Again, we're trying to reach people where they are. That is the goal. Thank you all for being skeptics. Thank you all for being at this talk. You already heard about my book. If you want to follow me, I'm on all the socials at Mohamed Noor. I mentioned the YouTube channel. Just search for BioTrekkie Explains, or you can find it that way. Thank you to my wonderful host for having me. Thank you all for being wonderful, both in the live chat or those of you who are watching it afterwards. Thank you for watching it later. And happy to spend some time taking some talks. Taking some questions.
Thank you, Dr. Noor. That was fascinating. Let me kick this off by asking, what's the reaction been to your work and the book from your academic biological community and from the Star Trek community?
Oh, great questions. I would say in the academic biological community, variable. I would say mostly positive, but variable in the sense of enthusiasm. Anybody who likes Star Trek, of course, is like, this is the best thing ever. Has been very positive about it. There are some people who, look a little bit down their noses like, why don't you just teach biology? There's a little bit of that. There's less of that now than I think there was, say, right when the book came out. I feel like now people are just really positive about this because I think this has been done more. I mean, again, I'm not by far not the first person to do this sort of thing. But as more and more of this happens, people are saying, okay, I see it. It actually helps not to just like get up to the chalkboard and talk at people about concepts, but to actually try to engage them in some other way. There's this whole concept of active learning that was around long before I did this that people are starting to appreciate. I would say the Star Trek community has been wonderful. I love the Star Trek community, and I see like lots of familiar faces here in the live chat. Thank you all for being here. But yeah, they've been wonderful. I mean, great attendance at my talks, great feedback at them. So I mean, yeah, that's been very rewarding, I'd say.
That's great. I also want to apologize a little bit for the glitchiness of the video. I suspect that Dr. Noor, someone in your house, is watching a lot of Star Trek right now. I could be wrong.
Who knows?
So I also want to thank Jeannie Scott, who normally hosts these. She let me do this because she knows I'm a shameless Star Trek fan and was really excited to do this. And just to give you an idea how much of a Star Trek fan I am, this is a picture that was taken of me at Yuri's night a few years ago in LA. in full Andorian gear. Anyway, I'm a huge fan. I did want to do one more plug for your book, which is Live Long and Evolve, available at good booksellers everywhere. And I had one more question for you before we take it to the audience, and that was you talked about the interspecies relations, the hybridization. And what I was wondering is there some specific mechanism or some specific barrier beyond which these species can't blend? And as a non-biologist, this is always kind of alluded to.
I love it. That is a great question. So, I mean, this gets at the whole question of how you actually define species. We define species as being a single gene pool. So some people say by virtue of the fact they can hybridize, doesn't that mean they're the same species? No, that doesn't mean that. Because mostly, as we like to say, speciation is not a point in time, but it's a process, right? So, for example, like dogs, wolves, we can think of all sorts of species that we know that can hybridize and form fully fertile hybrids. Or again, going back to our ancestors, humans, Neanderthal. Generally speaking, if you have different species, there's usually something that is preventing them from, in some way, having successful interbreeding. So it may be something that makes it so they're not, sexually attracted to each other. Maybe they breed at different times of day, or they're just found in different parts of a common environment. Or it could be that, for example, the hybrids are sterile. People often overemphasize that last one, think you have to have hybrid sterility or no hybrids produced at all to be different species. That's not true. There are definitely lots of cases of species known that where there's something which is preventing just free flow of genes. If there's free flow of genes, then they're not species. But if you have something that's slowing that down, then by the biological species concept, they are considered to be separate species. And it's interesting because Star Trek has kind of avoided that whole sterility thing. I've always been a little curious about that. Is there any case where like a hybrid's been formed and they're sterile? I haven't seen anything like that. What we do see in Star Trek, and this is actually mentioned in my book, there's a slight overrepresentation of female hybrids, right? And what's interesting is if you look across like species in general, generally speaking, if you have one sex of hybrid that is sterile or inviable, it tends to be the XY sex. So you should get an overrepresentation of female hybrids. I'm sure it's just a coincidence, the context of Star Trek, but I love it. It fits what's referred to as Haldane's rule.
Nice.
Yeah.
So I understand we're getting a little transmission in. We may have some questions from the audience. Could we get a question up here? Fantastic. Walter Ian K asks, can a life form with copper-based blood breed with a life form with iron-based blood?
Probably not. I mean, this is hypothetical, right? I mean, obviously there are things with copper-based blood, but they're like insects, and it's not even exactly blood. It's almost this hemolymph sort of thing. Probably not. I mean, it'd be really hard to have, what would the hybrid have? Would it be like both? Probably not. But these transitions have happened, though. So, I mean, I wouldn't say it's absolutely impossible because, again, we share common ancestors with insects, and they have this copper-based stuff. It's not exactly blood. We have iron-based, so...
But at the same time,
we don't. But I think it would be very challenging.
We're a little bit far away from insects, where we can't exactly breed with insects anymore.
Yeah.
So
very far away from insects.
Very far away. Can we have another question, please?
I see a bunch of them in the chat.
Michael Wong asks.
Hello, Dr. Michael Wong. Yes, by the way. He has a great podcast you guys should check out, by the way. It's called Strange New Worlds of Science and Star Trek podcast.
Oh,
2 thumbs up to Michael Wong.
Fantastic recommendation. So what are your thoughts on the return of the progenitors and their origin of life technology in season 5 of Star Trek Discovery?
Yeah. So I did not consult on season 5 of Discovery. I consulted on seasons 3 and 4, but not on season 5. I was excited when I saw that this was coming in there, even though, as you saw, I don't think the progenitor's explanation for the convergence of life works very well. It's still a really cool theory. It's still a cool idea that they were trying to incorporate some real science to try to get at this explanation. What I was scared about when that season was airing, I was very scared that there was a plot line in this season that there was a person who was very sick, and they're like, we're going to use this origin of life technology to make him come back to life. I'm like, what? Like, reanimating a dead person is not the same as the origin of life. There's no reason to think there would be any similarity. I was very afraid that's what they were going to do. They did not do that. It's like, oh, thank God. I was so scared that's what they were going to do. But no, they did not do that. They actually specifically said, no, we can't do that. Like, yes, that's correct. You can't do that. So kudos to them for getting that right.
We like
and without any help from me.
We like real science in our science fiction.
Yeah.
Can we get another question, please?
Stephen Jay Gould.
Oh,
somebody didn't like that question.
All right.
I'll say what I remember what it was. What do you think of Stephen Jay Gould's theory of punctuated equilibrium? I think it's an interesting concept. So let me define what that is. So Stephen Jay Gould argued that, thank you for getting that back. Stephen Jay Gould argued that standard evolutionary processes like natural selection, genetic drift, these sorts of things are not standard evolution, because what we see when we look at the fossil record, we see these sudden jumps, right? That we see like, here's this form, and it's basically there's a long period of being the same, and then all of a sudden it's very different. A long period of being the same, and then all of a sudden it's very different. And he suggested like that seems inconsistent with these sort of standard evolutionary processes we've talked about, like natural selection, which is much more iterative, at least the way we think about it. I would argue, and there's actually other paleontologists like George Gaylord Simpson, who said that you expect that from these same processes. You don't necessarily expect this sort of just gradual. It's not like global warming. I hate to use that example. It's not like global warming was just like, oh, the temperature keeps going up by 1 degree every year, on average, or something like that. You sometimes get these abrupt changes in the environment, or you sometimes get a new mutation with large effect. That is not in any way disproving the general idea of natural selection driven evolution with standard genetic mutations. So, I mean, I'm not saying he's wrong, but I'm saying I don't think it needs a unique explanation. That's the way I would put it.
All right. Next question, please.
If ancient humans were seeded to other planets, wouldn't the seeders also have to bring a whole ecosystem? Yeah, that's exactly right. I think I mentioned that, but I meant to mention it if I didn't mention it. That's exactly right. So yeah, if we're dropping off, we can't drop off people on Uranus or Neptune and just hope they'll be okay. Like, no, they would need everything they need to survive. So, and actually, I guess I didn't emphasize the ecosystem part. I just mentioned things about like what they need to live in terms of like food. But it's true. I mean, even that, it wouldn't be sustainable. Like, it needs to be sustainable for, thousands, millions, maybe billions of years, depending on how long it's going. So yeah, that's exactly right. Excellent point from Jeannie.
Great. Next question, please.
Another
one from Jeannie. And what would be the effect on the native organisms? I suspect natural selection would wipe out the new stuff pretty quickly.
Well, I guess so. It was a good question in the sense of like, was there native stuff? I mean, there may not have been native stuff. Maybe it was just kind of weirdly empty. And I mean, it depends on this whole sort of terraforming idea, which is common in sci-fi. I feel like it's overstated because I think terraforming would be an incredibly difficult thing. People often say that, like, why don't we go terraform Mars? Like, it would be so much easier to clean up Earth than it would be to ever terraform Mars. It'd be like a trillion-fold easier to clean up Earth. But yeah, I mean, it's possible. And
are you suggesting that Elon Musk may not be the best communicator of science to us?
You said not me.
Shock.
Part of it also in the context of whether we wipe things out, it kind of depends on what kind of life is there. Like if the other life is there is just so completely alien, it's barely even interacting with what we have, maybe not. But it's a good question. I love it.
Fantastic. I think we have a couple more questions.
Good.
How knowledgeable are Star Trek writers you've worked with about biological science, and how receptive are they to your science advice? Great question.
Let me tell you, I'm going to talk especially about the Star Trek Discovery writers because they're the ones who I worked with the most. I have never seen people that excited about science before. Like I remember, for example, I think you and I talked about this just a little bit before the talk started. For season 4 of Star Trek Discovery, they asked me about creating some sort of really alien aliens and having some sort of really difficult form of communication to translate. And I remember having to explain it, like these are like English majors or something like that, which nothing against English majors. I mean, I don't know anything about Shakespeare or whatever English majors do. But I remember having to explain over and over again, the difference between, say, an atom and a molecule and, and all these sorts of things. And they were captivated. They're like, oh yeah, tell me more about that. And I love Michelle Paradise, who's the showrunner for Star Trek Discovery. I remember at the end, as we were finishing things up, I remember her explaining this to somebody else, and it was spot on. She had it exactly right. And I was like, yes.
Nice.
But,
you've
and many of them too
well.
would make this. Yeah, many of these would make the comment to me all the time, like, your job is so cool. Like, you write Star Trek. What do you mean my job is so cool? I mean, like, it doesn't get better than what you do. But no, it's true. And the same with, I once met with the Star Trek Prodigy Writers Room, and they were very similarly super engaged, really excited about the science. And I should stress too, I mean, I don't want to overstate my role. I'm I'm somebody who's sometimes contracted as a science advisor. There is somebody who is the science advisor for the Star Trek franchise. Her name is Dr. Erin McDonald. She's an astrophysicist with a PhD from Glasgow. So she works with them like for all the shows all the time. It's just if they need a little bit of extra expertise, specifically in biology, they might reach out to me. I want to make sure I'm not overstating my role here.
Right, but they go to the experts when they need it. Since we're talking about the different series, you mentioned briefly that you're working on the new season that hasn't come out yet of Strange New Worlds.
I hadn't worked on it. It's been finished for a while, but yeah, I haven't done
I'm
it
not
recently.
going to ask you for spoilers.
Oh, I would never give it. They would kill me. They would sue me.
I do want to ask, like, you said you were very deeply involved with like season 4 of Discovery. How involved are you with the new season of Strange New Worlds?
Not that involved. Not that was
Okay.
much lighter touch. That was much lighter touch. Yeah.
Great. All right. Next question, please. Brian Hart asks, what about Hodgkin's law of planetary development as mentioned by Spock in the TOS episode Bread and Circuses in 1968, which I'm sure you know that script inside and out.
I remember the episode. I actually don't remember Hodgkin's law specifically. I don't remember what that is. I remember the episode. Yeah,
Okay.
I don't remember what that is. I'm sorry.
Sorry,
maybe
Brian.
If Dr. Wong is still here, maybe he knows the answer.
So let me kind of wrap things up with kind of a funny, interesting question you may not have had before.
Sure.
So I was listening to an interesting podcast where biologists were talking about the giant squid, something that at that point they had never found alive.
Oh gosh, is this the whole alien squid thing? Oh.
No.
Okay,
no.
Good. Thank you.
Oh no, it's way better than that. And they had found dead ones washed up on shore, and someone naturally asked, "What would a giant squid taste like? Like, would this be tasty?" And they said, "Well, we had one that had recently died that I have part of the carcass in my freezer." And so they took a little bit out, fried it up, and started to eat it, and discovered really quickly that it had all these chemicals in it, like formaldehyde, that kept it alive very deep in the ocean because it's like super high pressure. And it's like, just from a biological standpoint, they probably could have deduced that it would not have tasted very good. So my question to you is, of all of Star Trek's alien species, which one would be the most delicious?
Which one would be the most delicious? Tribbles.
They do look really, really like meaty and tasty.
There's actually there's a small series called Short Treks where they have these little 10 minutes. Yeah, you've seen those. Yeah. Remember there was one called shoot, it's late here. Sorry. What's The Trouble with Edward? That's it. The Trouble with Edward.
Yes.
He said that it's kind of like a scallop. You take all the hair off.
It does sound really good. Dr. Noor, thank you so much for your time tonight. This has been amazing. This has been like, I've learned so much tonight, and it's just been so entertaining. Thank you so much for joining us. Again, please check out Dr. Noor's book and his podcast and or YouTube channel, rather, right?
That's right. I call it podcast sometimes by accident, but yeah, it is a YouTube channel. Thank you for having me, Jay. It's great working with you. Thanks to everybody in the live chat. I see a bunch of names there. Stat Enthusiast, Walter Ian K, Bob D, War Dog Heim, Melissa Longo, Allison Leach Hyde, and Dr. Emery Siegel, Michael Wong. I see you guys on there. Thank you all for joining. Appreciate it.
And we've had a lot of people on the chat chiming in. So thank you all for joining and participating. This has been amazing. Thank you, Dr. Noor. I'm going to ask the rest of you just to hang out for a minute. I want to talk to you about our speaker for next month's Bay Area Skeptic Skep Talk. It's Gordon Pennycook, who will be talking about conspiracy theories and how we can use AI constructively to change the minds of believers of very irrational theories. It's really cutting edge research that every skeptic should know, and it comes with tools you can use. That's March 13th, the second Thursday of March at 6 p.m. Pacific. If you subscribe to our channel, it will pop up for you automatically. And with that, I wish you a good night, and please live long and evolve, my rational friends. Thank you.